Welcome, everybody. Super excited to be here with Tom Rarick, a longtime friend and colleague and mentor, and just an awesome human being. And super excited to just kind of jump in and dive into a lot of different topics around judging and design and collaboration and career and just anything that kind of comes up in our conversation. I think is an amazing, valuable resource for all of you. And I think the biggest thing that I want to stress as we're going through this conversation is Tom is like a really well-rounded, really well kind of experienced percussionist, designer, judge. He's kind of done it all on a lot of different levels of our activity and just the music scene in general, percussion scene. So I think that it would be an amazing journey that we're going to have today with your questions and with the discussion that we're going to have. So just want to jump in and say, Tom, thank you so much. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. This is a cool community you've created for sure. And I'm anxious to talk to you guys about whatever comes up, and that appreciate the introduction. I guess I have done a number of things, but I never feel like an expert in any of them, but I'm anxious to hear your questions and kind of learn from you guys too, as far as, you know, the conversations we can have back and forth and what we can unearth with some of these questions. So I'm excited.
You know, the first thing I want to kind of talk about is judging. I just want to get that as the beginning. And the only reason I want to start here is because we're kind of entering into that part of the season where the activity is starting to come back and we're starting to get our programs up and running and get stuff back on the floor and just get ready for WGI's return. And I think it would be an interesting conversation to like think about the judging before the season has happened, because normally what happens is the season starts and you start getting tapes, you start getting numbers, and you're like, you kind of react, right? And I just thought it might be a good place to start, just kind of refresh our kind of identity with judging. So the first question I had for you is just looking back as your time as a judge, you've gotten a chance to see a huge swath of groups across the entire nation and just at different levels of design, achievement, execution, resource, you know, and if you had like just, you know, able to distill a lot of those viewings, what are some of the things that you've seen that you're like, I wish we as an activity, we could fix this really quickly?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and just so you guys know too, predominantly I see groups from down low, like on the music sheet, you know, so I'm focused on those kind of things as far as like, what am I hearing? What are they doing? Content versus quality and all that kind of thing. So I guess, you know, when I started thinking about this question a little bit too, the biggest thing or the most common comment that I make on tapes usually is about things that are probably, or just a clarity of thought whether that's through performance or through design. It's usually it's the younger groups, less experienced groups trying to do too much. And I think we've seen a little bit of that in recent years with the expansion and kind of the weighting of the sheets and the addition of another visual sheet and that kind of thing, where there's so much being asked of the performers, like from a layered perspective, not just music making, but you know, what they're doing to support the concept, the movement wise, things that, you know, we're trying to do to get points. I think a lot of groups would be better served to think a little simpler, right? A little more, I think quality being more of a guide than maybe content. I know that maybe when you're designing shows, you're always like thinking about, okay, how's this, are we writing appropriate for the class? Are we doing enough to get the composition points? I think you'll find, at least from my perspective, it's really it's a separating factor when you can sample the parts of the ensemble and go, okay, they're making quality sounds in the tenor line, with the accessory player knows how to, just all the little details like that sometimes are overlooked, I think, for the overall kind of production of shows. So from our introductions, I assume most of us are musicians, and we come primarily from that perspective. I'm sure you do other things as well, as far as programming and visual design input and that kind of thing. But I think if we really start with like, okay, quality being like the guide and things filtering through that, and that can be simple things, just quarter note octaves on a vibraphone. Are those balanced? Are they together? Or are they orchestrated in such a way that that gives a sense of resonance and personality and a depth of sound and that kind of thing? Not the complicated stuff. It's the simple things that really, I think, encompass most of kind of what I evaluate, or like what I hope to evaluate in terms of quality sounds from an ensemble. So I would really, not to say you should write simple shows. You should write, I mean, I would think you would write appropriate to give your students a challenge and to like, so that their skills continue to grow so you can express yourself as a designer. That's all important as well. But as you're making that conversion from your notation program or sitting in front of your computer to actually hearing it being produced in the gym, I think really having an eye to those things where if you can like rest on the sense of like, okay, we're making quality sounds with even our simplest things, and creating a clear musical thought through that, I think that is something that will separate your ensemble from most that I see. Right. And I'm fortunate to judge some of the highest level, that 1% of, like those. I'm not necessarily, those groups know what to do. Like, I'm not really, it's the A class or the, that open class or even world class too, but just it's those ensembles that are finding themselves and what their identity is, what they prize, what they want to put forth as a style and that kind of thing. So, yeah, that's one of the biggest things I would say is just.
I mean, I feel
back to basics, quality, and that is that's something that's always like just a starting point for my discussions and critique. Usually, it's usually groups attempting to do a bit too much, and that's cool. I'm sorry to cut you off, Kevin, if you're getting back in, but it's cool from a vocabulary and challenge, and you love to see that the activity growing that way, but. You can see the groups that kind of achieve things from a macro perspective, where it's all kind of like it's cool, it's vibrant, it's active and hyper dynamic and all these things. But when you boil it down to like what's really happening at the tap level, or whatever that is for your discipline, that's really where the separation occurs, and that's something that can only really be built with quality from the beginning. I think that starts with your composition and your teaching working in tandem to create that quality. So
I was just going to say that, like, from that one question and response right there, like if you just walked away from this session and you like really let that sink in and like let that affect the way that you move forward, like that in and of itself was just like a huge mountain of gold. So hopefully you guys are absorb what just was discussed there. And I think that it's refreshing for me to even hear that, because we get so sometimes focused on all of the things that we want to aspire to, right? Like, here's all the things I want to learn and incorporate, and here's all the new challenges that I want to present, and here's all the I want to change people's hearts and minds with this beautiful sound and melody that I want to create. And at the end of the day, that experience that is being presented has, like, the underlying baseline has to be exactly what you just said, of quality. Like, is every single detail, every single ingredient that is being presented is of quality. And then I love the way that you put that, Tom. It was just like this kind of juxtaposition of just making sure that quality exists, but also challenging your students, right? Like knowing where that level is, and then expressing yourself as a designer, and all those three things coming together for that marriage, like, of your season. And I think not any one of those is in a vacuum, but they all come together. And I think that was a beautiful way of saying that. So that was awesome. Yeah. If I was going to follow up on this question a little bit, one thing that you mentioned was kind of what you see across all the divisions, right? I think something that's challenging to a lot of people is just classification in general. Sure. And I think especially classification in a year after COVID. Do you feel like there are any, I think that skill sets are a very clear classification bucket that groups can fall into. Do you find that there are design type identities that kind of delineate the different classes?
Identities, you mean like I guess what do you mean by identity? Like what
Like
they play?
compositional
Like,
depth or compositional variety. Like,
sure.
would you say that, this is a tricky question to ask because, I know as a purist that the classification is totally focused on just skill sets and achievement
Right.
by students, right? And their maturity level. But I think that there's also this like subconscious layer of, well, this is an A class show and this is an open class show and this is a world class show, where I think we know behind the scenes that it's like it doesn't matter what the show is. But I feel like there is a little bit.
I guess so. I mean, I think there's certainly a feeling like as you progress like through a day of a regional, like when you go A class to open to world or that kind of thing, where like it's like the imprint of the ensemble or the sonority and the depth of the presence of the ensemble. Certainly, there's more members usually in the the more advanced groups, that kind of thing, which helps. But I think with what most groups that are dealing with have is in terms of a sound system or in terms of instruments, that kind of thing. I don't think there's a reason why we should shoot for less, or like that's more of a blanket choice rather than a class choice to me, I think. Now maybe some of that is making what if you have a say you're 2, 2, and 4 in the battery and you have a couple cymbal players and a small front ensemble, it's going to seem weird if I don't know, making your ensemble believable from a sonic standpoint is also a value too. So I'm not just saying like make it like a like a cinematic event if it's doesn't look that way on the floor. But I don't think you should feel limited by the class you're in as far as maybe the ambition, the presence, and the kind of the effect you can have on an arena. Given what your show is or what you're trying to go for, that year. So in terms of identity, in a practical sense, yes, I think that certainly has an effect. Like it's just the presence and the depth and what's coming at you feels bigger and feels, different as you go through the classes. But I've seen A class or open class shows that have as much or if not more. And it's more of a stylistic choice, I think, and what's believable for your program and for your concept and what the visual is telling you, and so yeah, I don't think it necessarily has to be an open world decision if that's kind of what you're talking about with that.
Yeah, totally. And I think that also is another gold nugget term right there. This idea of believability, right? Like, and we talked about this before, just this idea that, well, maybe in A class, programming big like applause moments, that's tricky in A class, just because, like you said, if you've got 2 snares throwing down a snare moment in a room full of 20 people, it's hard to generate that level of,
right,
WGI finals night, Saturday night level of arena.
Sure.
So I think knowing some of those things should affect the way that you design for your students so that they are believable and that they can achieve a sense of wonder and excitement, but just maybe not in the traditional way of, crowd reaction.
Right. And like, so you're thinking about maybe like, an upper independent world snare line that has 9 or 10 members and they hit something, they can carry that moment themselves and carry the energy of an arena. They can do something split down the line, a rim shot in the end, and point, stick toss, whatever they do. That carries the moment because of the mass and of the technical, I think, ability of those members is enough to generate that effect. Maybe in A class or some cases open or whatever. I think you maybe have to be a little more creative. Like in like maybe moments, if you want to generate a reaction, it's through coordination, through color, through support from the front, unique instruments that punctuate and kind of give it a sense of personality, and you connect more members to maybe those moments that are maybe the ends or the middle or however you want to pace it. But maybe those are opportunities to really, don't expect the same reaction from, I guess is what we're saying, from a smaller ensemble or smaller group of performers. And you have to be more creative on how you produce those moments. Because I think it's still possible to, like you're saying, to affect those 20 people in the stands that are watching that smaller ensemble. I just think you have to be more open to other ways of doing it than you saw somebody else do it, with a larger group, and they have different tools at their disposal to produce those moments. So just create your own, and again, making it believable and kind of sound like it looks, and then produce it till it gets the reaction that you are looking for.
Perfect.
So
awesome. Well,
I had another one. To cut you off, I had another one about these trends and that kind of thing. I know some of you guys designed. Anybody design front and battery? It's just thinking. I mean, I see a lot of groups where it's obvious that the battery rehearses and the front rehearses, and the ensemble blend of that is quite a challenge sometimes. There could be great things going on front and back, but it lacks meaning or lacks a sense of kind of cohesion. So I guess I find myself talking a lot about, okay, cool stuff going on the floor. We see it happening up front, but the connection and the sense of like a choir of percussion ensemble or like kind of happening, that gets lost, right? Do the marimbas balance to the snares? Is there a connection? And that starts with the design process, obviously, too, but it's certainly an editing process too when you're getting that stuff on the floor, like knowing what you want this moment to be. Do the snares and bass drums function with the marimbas? And is that a blend? Is that something that you're really going to connect? And you're going to start with that as the base element, and you're going to build all your color and things around that. But I find a lot of times we're playing things at the same time, but we're not getting a sense of priority in terms of the balance of the ensemble. So I think, again, it's equal in terms of design and how you rehearse the ensemble as to how you get that. But I find myself talking, tuning is a big part of that, I think, where we have the tendency with, especially indoor, is to tune things a little higher, a little drier in most cases. And for smaller ensembles, that becomes really problematic because you have these more singular sounds that start happening, like with like high-pitched snares, and you have stratification, I think, of the elements, or just like a really wide disparity between things that create these holes in the frequencies. This sounds really technical now. Stratification of frequencies, but yeah, you guys are okay. But just, I think, trying to fill up the frequency range of your ensemble, not always, obviously. You're going to have moments that are more mid-range, treble, whatever, having a clear idea of what you want that to be, but especially for your big, all skate type moments, that's when those things really rear their head, because we have this kind of like, usually have pads in the synth or whatever that's kind of coloring and giving that sense of depth. We have the battery over top of it kind of doing their thing, and we have this hole in the middle of all that kind of mid-range frequency that kind of gets that tends to create noise rather than clarity. I use noise affectionately, I think, but just because we're all trying to play music. But I think the balance of those things and tuning has a lot to do with that. I think if you can get the battery to where when they play a unison figure, something simple or something complex, like I said, it really doesn't really matter. But if you can listen to the battery choir and like not hear the gaps between snares to the tenors to the bass drum, just filling in those gaps from your tuning, your touch, your sense of resonance from the ensemble, getting a good idea of that, getting the front the way you want it. And then the last step that we tend to miss is that kind of connection of the two, right? And then that's another editing process of taking away things that conflict or cancel out frequencies. Is that taking the vibes up an octave, or covering more of the instrument keyboard wise to get more of a sense of depth that mirrors what the battery's doing? That's the next level stuff that I think really, really separates ensembles as far as what you're able to read, what you're able to understand and appreciate as an audience member, and then, ultimately adjudicate from like, okay, what's happening here, and do I get it? Do I understand it? Or are you drawn to the fact that like, okay, this is a lot and I'm not sure what's happening? So that's a big thing. So I would think about tuning, think about frequency from your from the design perspective, and then be willing, obviously, to adjust once you hear it live, and spend time curating your sound and know what you want it to be. For me, it helps me to know in my head, like I hear this a certain way. Like if you've listened to enough music, when you're designing and I assume you like kind of have an idea what you think this might sound like. It's always different to me, at least. But if you're starting with a point where it's like, okay, I hear this section, the percussion ensemble sounding like this. You go to rehearsal, and then you start turning the knobs and like taking things out, adding things in, whatever that is, to make it sound like that. But having something you're shooting for, rather than you guys are probably way better at it than I am, but be able to reproduce or like create sounds on the computer that sound like you want it to be. For me, it's always different. Like I try really hard and take the time to detail and do what I can, but just being willing to adjust and hearing it in reality, and instead of shooting maybe for something that's not really reproducible, like from like what you hear and when I'm able to move faders in and in Sibelius or whatever. That's rarely what it sounds like in actuality, I guess. And that's maybe a technical limitation for me, but I think it's probably a practical thing just to stop listening to your MP3s maybe after a certain point, and shooting for that and kind of, realizing what it actually is, I think.
I think this is a big one. And, early in my career too, it's just being in front of the ensemble a lot more, just like really crafting. And, I think we've gotten to a point where, like I kind of just know when I'm writing, like what's gonna work and what probably will work, what probably won't. And these are the kinds of things that we want to share here, right? And like just so that you can pre-plan and pre-compose something that's just a lot closer to the finish line. But there is no substitute for that in-person kind of crafting. And I always say this to my students is that 50% of the magic happens on the computer, and the other 50% happens in person, in real life, in rehearsal. And you can't, divorce the two to get to that upper echelon in terms of just that quality blend across the entire ensemble. I think that is key, and you can tell when, I think you said this earlier, you can like really tell when you see an ensemble that is kind of, this, not to disparage, but an ensemble that is rehearsed by techs or educators versus an ensemble that is cohesively put together by, either a designer or, like the director of the ensemble, like that there is a sense of cohesion and that they're all saying the same thing and it doesn't feel like separate voices.
Yeah. I was just thinking as you're saying that, it's like you can hear an ensemble that's like rehearsed by technicians or one that's curated by a designer. Like you're really like arranging things thoughtfully, and that's something that, in a tech brain, you're like teaching, okay, this is together. It isn't, it's balanced. It isn't. But to really have like the perspective, and I think both are important, obviously too. That's something we can get into a little bit about collaboration as well, and how those two things kind of connect. I think they're both important elements. But yeah, for sure, there's no substitute for hearing your own design and getting your hands in there and working with it, and having the ability to relay that to your technical staff, or maybe that's you, or maybe that's a couple of people you have working with you, but being able to have words that allow them to be a little bit empowered, but also tell them exactly what you're looking for. And that comes from your thoughtful process of, design in front of the computer and time spent walking the dog or whatever it is. But, it's part of the process.
Totally. Tom, we got a question. Are there any smaller ensembles that you can recall as examples for achieving the kind of believable effect you were talking about?
Let me think. Smaller ensembles. Trying to think of names. Let me think. Well, they're not really small. When I was thinking about groups that aren't world class that create like an impression, but like Andrew High School, who's like from Chicago, I think area, like they're they just came to mind as they don't necessarily play world-class skills. Obviously, they oscillate between like A and open, I think, depending on the year. Most often open, but I mean they're wonderfully produced and that kind of thing. But I think they have a pretty good idea design-wise of what they want to get across with their members, and I don't see. I think they also kind of lean into the strengths of maybe being a little bit smaller or less technically advanced than a world-class ensemble. Things like space, things like I don't know, like leaning into things that aren't like maybe that suit your size, all right, and I think or your abilities. They kind of come to mind like that. So I guess think more in general terms. Groups that embrace their, I think it's the believability thing. I think we were talking about a little bit. Like you have the opportunity, I think, when you're a smaller group or a less technically skilled group, again, to do things that maybe aren't expected. All right, to leave space to really be, like things in singularity, like one triangle player can be meaningful, like it, because everything, you're not trying to involve 45 people most of the time in the show. Like you can really lean into individuals and things like that, or singular sounds or singular performers that, can have as much meaning as 40 people playing a rim shot over their head. It's, but I just think it's a certain design courage to take those leaps, because so much of developing an ensemble, or probably what we see or what we think of that being, is to move to that level where we're approaching some of those moments where what we see in the upper groups. So in a lot of ways, it's probably counter to like instincts. If a group would do that, it's rarely happened, honestly. And like, if a group would really embrace that kind of sense of space and intimacy and things that are maybe more easily achieved and suit maybe a smaller ensemble better, they would surely stick out during a regional day where you see 25 A groups or open groups or whatever. Those are competitive advantages, in terms of design. So it puts a lot of pressure on the performer, obviously, like in terms of, like if you're going to do that, it's like, it's a zero fail kind of thing. You don't have anything to lean on. So there's a certain courage and risk in that as well, which, should be rewarded, honestly, like on multiple sheets. But, it's an interesting thought. But as far as particular groups, I can't think of exactly like a name of a group or a show that comes to mind, but like that one group, Andrew, that came to mind, just because they kind of approach it a little bit differently, or have in the past. I remember they did, I think when they were still in A class, it may have been like First Circle or something in that vein of a thing. And it was just very much within the class vocabulary wise, but there was a sense of space and just like your shoulders relaxed. Like when you listen to it, it was like you didn't feel bombarded, a lot of time. And just, again, it kind of embraced the technical abilities of the students, like met them where they were, I think, and still challenged them. But it also had a sense of, this feels appropriate. This feels like really well detailed, and back to that quality thing. They certainly, usually have that as well. So,
yeah. And I'll just tack on one last thing to what you just said, which is, we don't always have to try to titillate the audience, like yeah. Quality is enjoyable.
Yep.
Right. Like watching someone play something or perform in a quality way in and of itself is a beautiful experience. And so I think that we have to remind ourselves of that as an activity sometimes, that we don't always have to just be, how can we, impress our bored audience?
Sure. That's honestly something Broken City has done extremely well. Obviously, I was kind of just, as I was describing, like zagging when everybody else is zigging. It's kind of like, that's kind of what you guys have, or at least my perception of a lot of your choices. I'm sure they came from, multiple inspirations, but in the context of, competition, that their identity is clear, right? I think in what you guys do. So that's maybe just stating the obvious there, but but yeah.
Awesome. Well, let's move forward. That was one big, massive question, but that was really awesome. It was a lot of nuggets there. Hopefully, you guys are digging into all of this stuff.